Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight for the kickoff of what looks to be a wonderful conference. I'm Jennifer Niles, the director of the American School of Classical Studies here in Athens, and it is my pleasure to simply welcome you and the organizers, thank the organizers for doing a wonderful job setting up this conference. But first, I might have a word about the honoree, whom most of you who use the Blagan Library know because he holds court at the end of table 14. Actually, it's his sort of home away from home office. But in addition to that, Edward has been a wonderful friend of the school. He has mentored many, many of our students. He has gone on trips and given lectures willingly, unlike our students who are forced to have topics forced on them. So he's been very generous with his time to our academic program, and we appreciate that very, very much. So I will now turn the podium over to the organizers of this conference in honor of Edward Harris, Sylviane Fachard, Mirko Cannavaro, and David Lewis. Welcome.
You got it. Thank you very much. When Mirko, Sylviane, and I discussed organizing a conference in honor of Edward to mark his 70th birthday, I thought that it'd be fun to hold the conference in Scotland initially, or to be more precise, on the island of Harris in the Outer Hebrides. It's rather remote. It has a population of about 2,000 humans and rather more sheep. And Edward didn't think that this was such a fun idea, but I'm glad to say that we chose the rather more appropriate location of Athens, and appropriate for two reasons. First of all, ancient Athens is the focus of much of Edward's research, which you all know, and present-day Athens is where he's made his home. We've been very fortunate in having been generously provided with locations to hold this conference, and by the British School for tomorrow and Saturday, and obviously by the American School for this evening's keynote by Professor Bresson. Sylviane, Mirko, and I think I can speak for Edward too, would like to thank Professor Bennett and Professor Niles for their generosity and assistance in this, and we would also like to thank the staff of both schools and for facilitating this conference. Before I hand over to my colleagues, I'd like to say a few words of appreciation about Edward. And I could mention his many seminal contributions to ancient history, his works on Greek law and politics, not to mention his wider interests in tragedy, slavery, religion, the economy, etc. But I will not remark further on these because, first of all, I'm sure that you're familiar with Edward's work, and secondly, because his scholarly output has been so voluminous that it would take all evening to get through it, so I'll talk about something different. So instead, I'm going to confine myself to a few remarks on something that perhaps many of you won't know, which is Edward as a PhD supervisor. I met Edward in 2005 in the final year of my undergraduate degree at Durham, and got to know him better as a master's student and then as a prospective PhD candidate when he kindly nudged me towards what he rightly thought would be a good doctoral project, a comparative study of slavery in Greece and the ancient Near East. During my doctorate, Edward coached me with great patience and humour, among other things, scheduling extra supervisions until I got the optative right, and introducing me to gin and tonic. But above all, he constantly encouraged me to aim as high as possible, and despite my unprepossessing credentials as a doctoral student coming from Northern Ireland, where unfortunately the school-level classical education was moribund in some places and non-existent in most, meaning that I had a lot of catching up to do with my peers. Edward showed complete faith in my potential nonetheless, and without that I would be doing a much more boring job today. And in the years after I received the doctorate, Edward's mentorship never flagged, and we have and still do collaborate regularly. So in short, this man got me started in the field, something for which I'll always be grateful. And now I'll pass over to Mirko Cannavaro.
Yeah. So the first time I met Edward was at a conference in Chieti almost 15 years ago. I had gotten in touch with him sometime before with a rather wild idea. So I had convinced myself that some of the documents found in the Attic orators may in fact not be reliable evidence for reconstructing Athenian law in institutions. The cheek. Everyone was using them rather liberally, and the big guns had been taking their authenticity for granted for a while. I tentatively proposed to him this as a possible doctoral project in one of the first emails that I sent him in broken English. I was tentative because I had been advised, roughly speaking, not to dare, and told that that would not be a suitable project for someone so young and inexperienced. I tried anyway. I had just finished reading his Democracy and the Rule of Law in Classical Athens, and had gotten the impression that this wasn't a guy very willing to accept orthodoxies at face value, but one rather ready to challenge them. Edward replied with great enthusiasm and told me that he was in fact about to deliver a paper on some documents in Andocides on the Mysteries, arguing just that. He then told me that he was coming to Italy for a couple of conferences, and that if I could join him at the conference, that may be a chance to meet up and discuss the possibility of a PhD. In Chieti, I immediately committed a very, very grievous faux pas. I dared to ask a critical question after the talk of a rather self-important Italian professor. The professor wasn't pleased. Edward was. As I was thinking on what to say tonight and on how to express my gratitude and give you a sense of the role that Edward has played in my development as a scholar, I kept coming back to this initial context. And the reason is that they sum something up that I found genuinely life-changing, intellectually inebriating, in fact, when I first started working with Edward as one of his PhD students. I had been raised in an academic culture that can at times be a bit too concerned with allegedly due deference to our betters or to our elders, often to our betters qua elders. Daring to say something new, let alone disagreeing with La Dottrina, was at times painted as a form of hubris there. Edward's attitude was different. Great ideas and great scholarship for him could come from anywhere and anyone. There was no default deference for authority, for the big job title, for the top university. Just look at the sources, and look again, and look again, and look a bit harder still, and then just go for it. You can be 24, first in your family to go to university, out of place and ill at ease in colleges and at formals and so on, but if you've done the work, you've got as much of a right and a chance to say something meaningful and to produce good scholarship as the giants of the discipline. I said inebriating, I should have said liberating, and fun. So much fun. He was great, it was fun to work with him. Because Edward, as you may know, also has a cheeky side, and likes it when the little guy challenges the big guns. He encourages it, just like he did in Chieti. So I have focused on what Edward represented for me as a supervisor, as a mentor and a friend. But if you look at the list of speakers at this conference, you'll see many names of young, less young, once young scholars. We are all here to celebrate Edward's scholarship and career, but also to thank him for his advice and for his encouragement, for his habit of telling us to dare to aim high and not to sell ourselves and our ideas short. It's something that he's been doing for a long time for his students in New York and then in Durham, and for many that were never formally his students. And he keeps doing it now as honorary professor at the University of Edinburgh, gifting his time and knowledge to many of my own PhD students, some in the audience right now. So before giving the mic to Sylviane, I would like to present Edward with a small present from some colleagues in Edinburgh, grateful for all the work he's been doing with our Edinburgh PhD students. I'll tell everybody, it's dark, you won't be able to see, Edinburgh gin. There's a theme here. Edinburgh gin is the pink one for which Edward has developed a bit of a taste during his many visits. So these have stopped for a while because of the pandemic, but we look forward to having you around more in the coming years. And this is kind of a ruse to lure you back to Edinburgh. So I'll just stop here, but deliver.
Thank you very much.
I will say a few words about Edward's Athenian years, which started in 2013 and saw him engage with archaeology at an unprecedented level. So in Athens, Edward became a senior member here at the American School of Classical Studies. He regularly took part in the school's academic program, literally hitting the road and visiting hundreds of archaeological sites, many of them you can see here on this map. Cellini says that since 2013, I quote, he has been on a trip almost every week except for the month of August. Now, when I was a Mellon professor at the school between 2017 and 2020, Edward regularly came to my trips to Western Greece, Epirus, Macedonia, Central Greece, Euboea, and of course Athens and Attica. Now, for those who don't know about the regular program, let me just read a few lines from the official description. The trips are indeed rigorous and intensive. We travel mostly to remote sites on a bus and explore them on foot, including steep climbs over uneven, rocky terrain or through dense scrub for about 11 to 12 hours per day in all weather conditions. We may experience very hot weather and may also have chilly weather and rain once we reach high altitudes and as the fall progresses. In 2018-2019, the participants of the program walked some 980 kilometers, end of quote. Edward regularly gave site reports and seminars on complex sites such as Thassos, the Agora, Iani in Macedonia, and Olynthos. He also delivered lectures on crucial inscriptions or historical topics, such as the Amphictyony in Delphi, manumissions in Delphi too, the Stèle des Braves on Thassos, or the market economy while visiting Dime Agoras in Attica. And the day usually ended with a gin and tonic and white wine over dinner, some of which became really memorable. Edward often told me that this opening toward archaeology changed his approach to ancient Greek cities, monuments, landscapes, and economic history. I've been on the road with him for weeks, and his curiosity and willingness to address complex issues and problems are really remarkable. He's also in great shape. Edward climbed many mountains and hills, often to see nothing, except for the foundations of an ancient tower preserved some 30 centimeters above the ground. Now, he never complained, nor made snarky comments, or perhaps just once or twice. One site where he openly complained was the Zogenante School of Aristotle in Mieza, outside Nausa. There, as you can see in this picture, he opened his umbrella and he literally not engaged with the archaeology, but remained very polite about it. Thank you, Edward. I never told Cellini, but his most remarkable feat was climbing the Aios Nikolaos mountain in southern Euboea in the middle of winter with no path, close to zero visibility, and a vertical ascent of 600 meters under terrible conditions. And this is a Swiss speaking here. Now, while visiting sites and monuments, Edward was always eager to confront the literary and archaeological evidence. And this eventually led to our destruction volume. Now, the idea of this book sprung during the American school trips. And while visiting cities that had sustained destructions or had been allegedly razed to the ground, it appeared that the archaeological signature for the destruction was often elusive, if not missing entirely. Although we were struck by the high number of cities that allegedly sustained destructions, we were also surprised to see how many of them seemed to have recovered in a span of just 1 or 2 generations. It became increasingly clear for us that there was another story of destruction to be told, one focusing as much on the immediate événement, the impact of the event, as on the recovery phase in the long term. So we decided to organize a conference on this topic, and Professor Jennifer Niles was kind enough to host it at the American School, and then the book came out in 2021. Our book was produced during COVID. However, turned out the pandemic appeared as an opportunity. I still remember vividly our daily editing and writing sessions over several months, 2 hours if not more in the morning. And we would go through the chapters together, read them aloud, and edit them together. And during these sessions, I was able to appraise the supervisor and mentor that David and Mirko celebrated. So Edward, really on behalf of all the co-organizers, thank you. Daskale, thank you. Now it's our immense honor and pleasure to welcome Alain Bresson, is Robert Anderson Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus in the Department of Classics and History at the University of Chicago. Now Alain Bresson received his doctorate from the University of Franche-Comté in Besançon, entitled Recherche sur la société rhodienne, under the direction of Pierre Lévesque. He then became professor of ancient history at the University of Bordeaux between 1994 and 2007, before moving to Chicago. Now, as you all know, his research includes the epigraphy of Rhodes in Asia Minor, the Hellenistic world, and of course, the ancient economy. Now, as a student, I grew up literally reading his work in French, especially the two titles you have here on the screen, La Cité Marchande, published in 2000, and his monumental L'économie de la Grèce des Cités, in 2 volumes, published in 2007 and 2008. Now, most of you probably know this, the English translation and expanded edition of his book, published in 2016, The Making of the Ancient Greek Economy, Institutions, Markets, and Growth in the City-States. The book offers a groundbreaking new theoretical framework for studying the economy of ancient Greece. It should be read by every historian and classical archaeologist, not once, but again and again, for it addresses topics such as climate, demography, transportation, agricultural production, market institutions, money and credit, taxes, exchange, long-distance trade, and economic growth. Edward and Alain have known each other for many years, and I can assure you that Edward was delighted when Alain accepted the invitation to deliver the keynote of our conference, entitled Law and Trade Organization in Hellenistic Delos. Alain.
Okay. You've been too generous, Sylvia. Well, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, colleagues, and students, dear Edward, it's a great honor for me to give this keynote lecture. And first, I would like to thank Dr. Jennifer Niles, the director of the school, who welcomes us tonight, and thanks the staff of the school, which helped me to prepare this presentation. I would like to thank also the organizers, David Lewis, Mirko Canevaro, Sylvain Fachard, for the invitation to deliver this lecture at the American School. Indeed, it's a special pleasure to deliver this keynote lecture for this conference organized in honor of my dear friend, Edward Harris. Law has been the central topic of Edward's research over the years, and of course, inspired by the words of Pindar quoted by Plato in the Gorgias, Nomos Basileus, I will talk about law. In the mouth of Callicles, Socrates' most virulent opponent in the Gorgias, Pindar's quote has a sense that may seem upsetting for us. For Callicles, the law corresponds barely to a balance of power, where the strong imposes his will on the weak. For Callicles, in a city, I quote, the makers of the law are the weaker sort of men and the more numerous, end of quote. Lawmakers make the laws in their own interest and to their own advantage. By their sheer number, the lawmakers thus manage to dominate those who would be naturally stronger. I won't go any further in this analysis of this fascinating dialogue, but from the Gorgias, we may keep three principles to analyze a civic law. First, a law is made by a people to modify a certain state of affairs. Second, the law is made to the benefit of the lawmakers, who themselves constitute the majority of the voting body. Third, the law inevitably targets a certain category of people who without the law would take advantage of the current state of affairs. Let's see whether we can make use of these principles in analyzing a famous law of Delos. So, as announced in my title, I will talk about the Dealing law on wood and charcoal. What I will propose you is to reanalyze this law step by step. My approach will be deliberately that of an economic historian, with also, perhaps unexpectedly for the distinguished specialists of law in the audience, a special emphasis on archaeology, but after all, it's for Edward. This is perfect. In the epigraphic corpus of Delos, we have references to laws in various contexts in the form kata to nomon, kata tus nomus, or kata nomus kai psephizmata. Obviously, however, these allusions do not bring much to our understanding of the corpus of ancient Didian laws. But we are lucky enough to have the full text of one law, which miraculously has been almost fully preserved, the law on wood and charcoal. The stele bearing the law, as is still visible today, was found in the foundation levels of the so-called Porticte Philippi. This stoa was built in the port district, but not directly on the shore, especially since the sea level was significantly lower than today, and the seashore more distant from the stele than it is today. The Porticte Philippi was built before 200 BCE, which provides a terminus antiquem for the inscription. The script and grammar of the inscription correspond also to a date in the 3rd century, but neither to the very beginning nor to the very end. The inscription is almost fully preserved, except for its upper right part. The right parts of the first 3 lines of the law are missing, as you see on this slide. Well, the damage may seem minimal, but it has had significant consequences for the interpretation of the text. Besides, the structure of the law is simple. The first part specifies the conditions of the sale of wood and charcoal at Delos. The second one sets out the procedures and penalties against the offenders. The third one defines the special conditions for the tax exempts. I will focus here on part 1 and 3. As usual, for such a text, the law has been published and commented many times. In 1905, Maurice Holleau both announced the discovery of the inscription and gave of it a French translation that has long remained authoritative. In 1907, Schulhoff and Huvelin published the law in the BCH with a translation and good commentary. In 1915, Adolf Wilhelm made some improvements, and it's fair to say that Schulhoff and Huvelin's text, as modified by Wilhelm, became the standard version of the law and was several times republished. Fundamentally, no change intervened in the establishment or interpretation of the law until 1994, when Gary Rieger, in his fundamental study of prices in Delos, reopened the debate of the interpretation of the law. He saw in this law a way for the city of Delos to increase its revenue. Gary Rieger's publication was followed by a series of new studies by Raymond Descartes, my colleague and friend of the University of Bordeaux, by myself, and by Véronique Jankowski. As you can see, the interpretations vary significantly. Although Schulhoff and Evelyn and I have insisted on the will of the city to check price increase. By contrast, Gary Rieger thought that the main goal of the law was to increase the revenue of the city. For Raymond Descartes, the point was to harmonize the prices of the goods in transit and those that were sold in the local market. Véronique Jankowski prefers to see in the law an attempt to regularize the traffic of wood and charcoal. These are very different interpretations, and therefore it's necessary to come back to this law. But first of all, I'd like to underscore Véronique Jankowski's fundamental contribution. As it happens, with the authority of a printed restoration, the text had not been seriously questioned since the early 20th century. However, Véronique Jankowski has brilliantly proposed a new solution for lines 1-3. The initial text was grammatically bizarre, with 3 short sentences repeating the verb polein, line 2, line 3, and 5. The new text, with the introduction of me exesto, which is expected, of course, in such a law, line 2 is much clearer. We have lines 2, 3, me exesto, etc., polein, and line 3, 5, mede, etc., polein. The new restorations make perfect sense and provide a new basis of interpretation. It is Véronique Jankowski's text that I will use here. There remains, however, a series of points of debate in the interpretation of the law. First of all, what about the goods sold? We meet our first challenge in the interpretation of the first lines with the indication anthrakas mede rimus mede xyla osa poleitai tos tatmois tos xylerois. The same question applies to lines 33, 34, tapolumena to xyleros tatmo. Do we have here a reference to thasmos xyleros, a place dedicated to the sale of woods, or to a statmon xyleron, a weight used to sell the wood? I will try to persuade you that the second option, that of the weight, is the correct one. First, in ancient Greece and also in Rome, firewood was sold by weight. Among several possible examples, we have the case of Chios, where the leases of the Clytidae refer to a delivery of 30 talents of wood. Of course, the talent here is weight, not a sum of money. In the accounts of the sanctuary of Delos, firewood was also sold by weight. We see here a sale of 18 talents for a total of 30 drams. By contrast, as is also well known, timber was sold by volume unit. In Delos, we see references to a beam of 16 cubits and another one of 10, and rafters of 4 cubits and 1 foot. So difference between firewood and timber. The Latin language separated lignum, firewood, from materia, timber. In Greek, however, there was only one word, xylon, xylon. Therefore, from the start of the law, from the beginning, it was necessary to clarify that the xylon at stake in the dealing law was not timber, but firewood, the one sold by weight, osa poleitai tos taismos tos xylerois, the charcoal, logs, and wood that are sold measured by the weights for the wood, not timber. Other arguments can be brought forward that suggest endorsing the weight hypothesis. First, to the best of my knowledge, stasmos is never mentioned in a context for selling of goods. By contrast, metra kai statma, measures and weight, appear together very frequently. Then, for the definition of a location, we would expect the preposition in. Finally, poleitai with a dative is a regular passive complement with the meaning of by the means of poleitai statmo. Thus, in an inscription from Didyma, we have polestai de panta statmo, sell everything by weight. Similarly, in a regulation for macrophia, we have polymen statmis kotarois to sell with certified weights. On the contrary, the Athenian decree concerning weights and measures of the end of the 2nd century BCE, very famous, refers to tous poluntas ti en te agora e en tois ergasterios, etc., the sellers in the agora, in the workshops, in the shops, in the taverns, and in the warehouses, with the preposition en as expected. It remains for us to determine what the measures, metra, scales, ziga, and weights, statma, mentioned for the law look like. We should also explain why it seemed necessary to specify the use of these measures and weight, as we have mentioned in the law of statma xulera kai metra antrakera. You see the question. In principle, for weights, for instance, a talent is a talent. And for measures, for instance, a kynix is a kynix, whatever the good that is weighed or measured. So why metra antrakera or statma xilera? As to official measures, they are well known, and from Athens comes several examples of official liquid measures, top left, of dry goods, top right, of nuts, below left, and even a marble standard for tiles below right. Interestingly, from the Roman agora comes a stone originally published by Koumanoudis with inscription Medimnos Anthrakon Demosios. The Medimnos for charcoal from the Roman agora is neither a weight nor a mount placed under the measure or coffin used to measure the charcoal, but just like for the marble tile of the agora, to my opinion, a stone replica of the official measure for charcoal. Indeed, we know that in Delos, the sanctuary bought its charcoal by measuring it in kalatoi, that is, in baskets. We have other parallels for our statma xilera, again, metra antrakera. Aristotle refers to oinera kai sitera metra, measures for the wine and for the grain. A decree of Athens mentions metra sitera, measures for the grain. In Delos itself, we have mentioned a metron siteron and a sekoma siteru emimedimnu. Several reasons may explain why some weights and measures, I say some, were specifically defined for certain categories of goods. In Delos, a kalatos was certainly a specific volume unit. In other cases, there was probably the necessity not to use the same measure for two different goods. Just like today, it's forbidden to store successively wine and gasoline in the same tank. Finally, the use of specific tools could be linked to the specificity of the commodity, as we will see for wood, with in addition sometimes specific magistrates in charge of a specific category of goods, and thus in control of a specific set of weights and measures. Firewood, which was measured by weight, and as we know commonly in talents, is a very bulky and heavy commodity. The scales used to weigh wood had to be large scales. We have several depictions of large scales from ancient Greece. To start with the famous Arcesilas cup from around 565-560 BCE, which shows probably the weighing of Sylphion in Cyrene. A bit later, we have an Attic black figure, amphora, which shows the weighing of an undetermined merchandise. This might be, the weight might be in the left pan and the commodities in the right one. This is my opinion, I'm not sure. But in any case, this was a heavy and bulky merchandise. If the weight in the left pan, you just check. It's a very big weight. We can also safely use a mosaic from Hadrumetum near Carthage of the mid-imperial period. We see the unloading of goods from a ship. Note the two dock workers to the right, naked or half naked, possibly slaves, were probably in charge of the unloading of the ship. To the left, we have two characters occupied to weighing the unloaded goods. And as we see in more detail, they are well dressed, and the character to the left might be a soldier, again, to my opinion, but if you look carefully, it might be the case. The goods have long been interpreted as metal ingots. More recently, Andy Wilson has proposed to see here wood, which is a very attractive suggestion, in fact. We have the goods on the left pan and the weight on the right pan. The weight is comparatively of large size. Those who know me like that, I know there's big historical jumps toward the Middle Ages or to the Middle Age into the Middle Ages or the early modern period. So let's jump to the early 16th century with a stained glass window of the Tournai Cathedral, now in Belgium. We see again in use large scales to weigh several types of goods. Here it's a barrel which is weighed with the weights in the right pan. To the right, we have also controllers taking notes, sitting at a desk. Check this, we'll see almost the same depiction in a few minutes. Finally, I can show you these large scales from Barcelona of the 20th century. These images help us to figure out what was at stake with the scales to weigh firewood in ancient Delos. They were large scales, and weighing firewood was probably their main usage. As to the weights now, we have thousands of weights of small size all over the Greek world, like, for instance, these lead weights of a mina and a half mina, and this somewhat heavier marble weight of the imperial period, which weighs 2.5 kilos. But these were not the big weights that had to be used for weighing a bulky commodity, such as firewood, again in talents, 26 or 29 kilos. 29 kilos. But thanks to the generosity of Elspeth van der Wilt, I can show you two heavy weights coming from the excavation of the port of Tanis Heraklion in Egypt. The first one is a big granite weight of 28 kilos. Whatever the actual weight unit at stake here, this weight is in the order of the weight of an Attic commercial talent in the Hellenistic period, that is a little over 29 kilos. The second one is even larger. It's a big quartzite weight of 46.5 kilos. This is still unpublished material. The book of Elspeth should be published really in a few months. The comparison with the heavy weights of Tanis Heraklion helps us to figure out what the Delian weights for the firewood looked like. Now let's travel to the Latin-speaking world once again. This is a world where we have also ships designed to transport firewood, vectrices lignorum, that interestingly, neas vectrices lignorum, that interestingly Ulpian defines also in Greek as xulegoi, wood carriers. The word appears in the papyri of Egypt. And this is the world where we have navicula viculari lignari, merchants specialized in a commerce of firewood. But we may also go to Otricoli, the third below the map. Otricoli is the mid-Tiber Valley, a port that specialized in the shipping to Rome of wood from the Apennines. From Otricoli, the ancient Ocriculum, comes a large weight of 56 kilos, officially of 150 pounds, which is defined as pondus lignarium, which is the exact equivalent of the stathmon xuleron. Thus, having in mind the size of the scales and the weight that had to be used to weigh firewood, it is clear that if the local magistrates in Delos did not provide access to these instruments, the big scales, the big weights, the traders were unable to sell their firewood. Now, let's come to the main purpose of the law, the prohibition of intermediaries. The purpose is expressed in a series of clauses at the beginning of the law and clearly stated from the start. The charcoal, logs, and wood that are sold measured by the weights for the wood, it is forbidden to sell them if they have been bought in Delos. End of quote. What was decided was an absolute prohibition of reselling firewood and charcoal. Then a series of other clauses come to make this prohibition more explicit and to foresee the cases where sellers could be tempted to bypass the law. This concerns clause number 3, I quote, the merchandise sold at public auction as well as wood, logs, and charcoal for a third party. The law gives also the positive version of the previous prohibition, lines 8 and 9. Let only importers in person be allowed to sell. In other words, middlemen were not allowed to participate in this trade under any circumstance. Now, what about clause number 2 with its reference to a ship employer? The question has been heavily debated. Before coming to this point, one should answer a preliminary question, that of the customs declaration. We know from lines 13 and 14 that it was a declaration to the Pentecostologoi, the customs officer. But what is the meaning of eis auton ten apographen poiesamenon polein? From the law of Kyparissia in the western Peloponnese, we know that when unloading a ship for import and before loading for export, it was mandatory, I quote, to make a written declaration to the Pentecostologoi, and of course to pay the 2% taxes. A regulation from Kaunos of the early imperial period also refers to the declaration to the customs officer, to the Pentecostologoi. The famous relief of the tabulari from Portus, the port of Rome, helps us to visualize the scene with the unloading of amphoras and the customs officers keeping a record of the operation. You remember Tournai, right? That's something similar. And yet, what about eis auton? It may seem tempting to think of a parallel with the privilege of tax exemption of ateleia eston idion oikon, the privilege of tax exemption if you import for your own house, for your own use, for their own consumption. As you can see, for instance, here in an example from Pliny, there are several others, of course, eston idion oikon. But it's not what we have here, it's auton, not idion oikon. In fact, the law refers to a different process, and a better parallel may be found in a papyrus from Elephantine of around 224, 223 BCE. Here we have the case of a local embalmer who owes a tax of 2,800 drams to the sacred treasury at Edfu, but who has paid only 2,000. Thus, he still owes 600 drams. In his letter to the regional administrator of sacred taxes, the local administrator underscores that the amount is recorded in the name of the embalmer by the secretaries, or that is the sum, the 600 drams, or kai anagraphetai eis auton dia ton hierogrammateon. The point is to make sure that the sum shall be duly recorded in the name of the tax debtor. With the reflexive form eis auton, this is also what we have in the Delian law, and we should translate, it's also forbidden to sell any of this merchandise after having made the import declaration in one's name. The declaration, import declaration, in this case, in one's name, eis auton. We may now come to one of the most heavily debated questions raised by the law. As you remember, the first 3 lines have long been debated and questioned. The first 3 lines were read for a long period, and the debate was based on the text of the upper part of this slide, the text of Holleaux, Schulhoff, Vlin, and Villene. From Maurice Holleaux to Raymond Descartes, the onta of line 3 has been understood as an accusative masculine singular and as a reference to a trader being on a ship, onta ento plio. In 2006, I suggested that the onta was an accusative neuter plural and referred in fact to the goods on the ship, not the person operating the ship on the ship. I've been followed by Véronique Jankowski, who also decisively transformed the text with her restoration below mede onton, and we have mede onton employo tuton. The law refers to the goods that are on the ship, not to the people who operate the sail. The difference may seem of minor importance. It is in fact crucial in interpretation, and once again we owe this to Véronique Jankowski. The three hypotheses have been proposed to make sense of the text. For Raymond Descartes, the goods were not unloaded. They were sold by traders operating on board of the ship. Customs duties were paid and the goods were sent to another port. But the reasoning contradicts the principle of declaration, and the payment of custom duties took place at the time of unloading. If you don't unload, you don't have this process. In order to get out of the aporia, I suggested in 2006 that what was prohibited was to sell the goods after they had been reloaded on board of the ship. A second unloading would have been prohibited. Well, I tried to find a way to move beyond the aporia. I now believe there is a much simpler solution, a regular process of unloading at one time only. But then, why this mention of the goods sold on board on the ship, and what was the object of the clause? To solve the enigma, we must go to merry old England and medieval Exeter. Exeter is famous for a beautiful cathedral, but in the medieval period it was also a small but lively trade port. Besides, Exeter is a wonderful comparison. There is 3,500 people. There were 3,500 people in the city. It's a very small city that can be compared to Delos in some way. As you can see from the dots on this map, Exeter was connected to many other English ports, but also to a series of French and Flemish ports. The customs records of Exeter have been analyzed by Marianne Kowalewski in her book of 1993. From Kowalewski's analysis, we learned that there were in Exeter 2 categories of importers. On the one hand, non-local traders from other English ports or from overseas, from France and from Flanders, and local importers. Although local importers typically number below 20% of the importers, they own over 50% of the imported goods because they traded the goods that they had imported for themselves. But furthermore, they also bought in bulk large quantities of goods from foreign importers who didn't want to retail import themselves. I think that this comparison is key to reveal the organization of trade in Delos and beyond Delos in the ancient Greek world. In Delos also, standard goods could be retailed either directly by importers, that's what you have in red on the right of the screen, or by local middlemen who bought the goods in bulk. And just like in medieval Exeter, a middleman in the left might well have been commonly responsible for trading directly a large part of the imported goods in Delos. What the law makes it clear is that at Delos, for standard merchandise, the goods bought by the middleman were bought while they were still on board of the ship, and it was up to these local middlemen to pay the customs duties. So we understand now what the purpose of the law was. Now we see the special case of wood and charcoal. For these goods, reselling was prohibited, and the middlemen were totally excluded from this market. Final consumers, to the left in blue on the screen, could buy on board of a ship, just like middlemen, for standard goods. But reselling was totally prohibited. Only emperor, to the right, in red, could legally sell in the agora. Only them, of course. We can now safely translate close to. It's also forbidden to sell any of this merchandise after having bought them when they were on board of a ship and after having made the import declaration in one's name. The last question that remains to clarify is what is at stake here in terms of, is it a question of quantity control or price control? The sentence let them not be allowed to sell at a price either above the one that they have declared in writing to the pagan Stologoi or below it. You can see it in red on the screen, has puzzled the specialists. We may easily understand why the law could forbid to sell at a higher price. But why forbidding selling at a lower price? This seems counterintuitive. To start with, first remark, pleionos and elasonos, it's a genitive of price, which is perfectly expected in terms of price, if we think it's a price control. And then several parallels help us to make sense of what is at stake here. Let's come back to Plato, but not to the Gorgias this time, but to his nomoi. In Plato's ideal city, shopkeepers are under the strict control of the magistrates. The retailer, I quote, shall name one price only, and if he fails to get this, he will be entitled to take the article away. But he shall not put any other price, higher or lower, upon it on that day. End of quote. Me timese pleonos me de elatonos. This is exactly what we have in our Delian law. In his play, The Cauldron, the Attic comic writer Alexis mocked the political leader Aristonicus. I quote, he is currently proposing a law that any fish seller who offers to sell someone a fish and then lowers the amount and gives it to him for less than the price he specified initially, hypotimesas apodot elatonos and eipetimes, is to be hauled off to jail immediately. The hope is that they'll get scared and be satisfied with a cheap price. Tes axias agaposin. Here, axia is cheap, it's not appropriate. Or else all their fish home in the evening rotten. End of quote. Alexis explains clearly the logic that justified Plato's law. The law played a role of deterrent. If from the start the fish seller proposed a price that was too high, the customers would visit the shop of his competitors, and because he couldn't lower his price, he would be forced to bring back home his fish, which of course would be rotten and lost. This is a situation similar to that of the prisoner's dilemma, dear to John Nash, but with only one prisoner, the fish seller. Aristonicus, the proposer of the law, was not a fictional character referring to Plato as stated in the French Budet edition of the Laws. He was a leading democratic politician of Athens' Lycurgan era. Among others, he is known to us for being the proposer of two measures. Perhaps in 335-334 BCE, together with Lycurgus, he was the proposer of the famous and much debated law about the little Panathenaia and the sharing of the meats between Athenian people. In the 330s, also, he was the proposer of the decree for the deployment of an Athenian fleet against pirates. This was a way to protect the grain supply towards the Athenian Emporion. The law about fish selling fits perfectly with the other two measures. as put by Alexis, even the old woman or old man or slave would be able to buy cheap fish. So 3 measures aimed at securing food at a good price, cheap price for the people. In the case of the emperor, we would turn retailers in the dealing agora. From the beginning to the end of the selling process, the law made sure that their prices wouldn't be modified. I quote, "Let importers also make a written declaration to the agora nomoi before the sale of the same price that they have declared to the Pentecostologoi." So this we have now on this slide makes things clearer. The same price is declared to the Pentecostologoi and to the agora nomoi before selling. This would put maximal pressure on the importers, whose best interest was to declare a cheap price if they wanted to avoid remaining trapped in Delos, waiting for clients who have to reload their goods and pay the custom duties a second time. As to the economic reasons that motivated the Delians to pass this law, I've already exposed my view elsewhere, and I will only briefly summarize the situation. All over the Eastern Mediterranean, there was a period of huge inflation following the release of the Achaemenid treasures. It is well marked here on Reinhard Pengruber's graph of barley prices in Babylon. The period of high inflation corresponds to the period of 320 to 290 to 80 BCE, and then the price trend remained flat. From Gary Rieger's study on Delian prices and from other sources, we know that the Aegean experienced a similar inflation outburst for the same reason, same period following Alexander's conquest, which also lasted until 290 to 80. After that, the price trend in Delos remained flat. But the contrast couldn't be clearer with the prices of hogs and firewood, which experienced ups and downs in the 3rd century, with the trend toward higher prices. The contrast between the evolution of barley and oil prices and that of pigs and firewood can be explained by the difference in terms of market. The prices of barley and oil were those of the international market. In the 3rd century, Delos began to play the role of a regional trade hub in the Aegean, and its sanctuary was also very successful. The demand for hogs, firewood, and charcoal was high, and the supply, necessarily regional, when you don't transport pigs thousands of miles away, and the same thing for firewood. So the regional supply was insufficient. For this reason, the price of these goods was higher than those of other commodities. And it is to offset the price increase of goods that were in high demand from both the ordinary people and the sanctuary that the city passed this law. Here we remember the Gorgias. The law inevitably imposes constraints on certain categories of person. The Delian law both prohibited the profits of middlemen and deterred the emperor, turned into retailers, to make large profits from selling wood and charcoal. To conclude, the law of Delos satisfies the 5 criteria defined by Edward Harris and David Lewis in their recent article. First, the law is enforced by a political authority, here the city of Delos. Second, the law is for general application and regulates large groups of persons. Here, all the people involved in selling wood and charcoal. Third, certain behaviors are constrained by the law. Here, it is the process of selling and buying wood and charcoal. Fourth, the law provides a procedure against those who violated. Here, the second part of the law details the procedure of accusation. And fifth, the law provides a sanction against offenders. Here, a penalty of 50 drachms is provided against those who are found guilty in the second part of the law. So, yes, indeed, the Delians were good lawmakers. Thanks a lot.
Is my microphone on? Thank you very much, Alain, for a wonderful, wonderful lectures.
Are there other questions or?
Yes, so I'll open it to the floor if there are any questions, and I'll wait. People from their own computer can also ask questions, and I'll read them out. So, who wants to get started? Yeah, David? Is there a microphone to go around?
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. I wonder about another use of firewood, which should be keeping warm in winter. And I'm reminded of that passage in Aristophanes, and I can't for the life of me remember the play, but I'm sure most people will, where a poor person's demanding, a law to allow them to bed down in a forge during the winter time so they can keep warm. And this is another one of these basic needs of poor members of the community that can be undercut by wealthy middlemen who are going to buy up all the this key commodity and then gouge the price. And could that be partly something that's going on here? It's I've not been on Delos in the winter. You may have been. I wonder how how cold it gets and whether there's older members of the community and so on who are already freezing, and that could be a possible motivation too.
This is a possibility. Actually, well, to come back to the general picture, I think that there was a kind of, there was an expansion, a boom already in Delos in the 3rd century. More people, more everything, more prosperity in some way. But prices for wood and charcoal, which is damaging. And I think that maybe ordinary people, because if we've come back to the cauldron, to Alexis, it's ordinary people, as you said, we may be freezing in the winter and say they are not satisfied with the situation, just like today some people are not satisfied with the price of gasoline or etc. And so there was a pressure, and so let's pass a law to check this. And the role of middlemen, it's very interesting, the case of Exeter also, because in Exeter we have middlemen who, it's a very trade-oriented city apparently, and people complain against the profit of the middlemen also, unjustified profit of the middlemen. I'm not sure we have a similar law, but it was also a debate. So the way was to shorten and just to let's keep the middlemen out. That's my view at least.
Yeah, not to compare Delos to Scotland, but one of the big issues for people at the very poorest end of society, where I live, is the winter heating allowance. This is the thing they're most terrified about.
Yeah, I think I should check again. You're right. I should check what the publication of Gary Rigger's book, and see if there are higher prices maybe in winter. That might be an indication, because we have very lucky for Delos to have some prices also from various seasons. Might be an indication.
As I remember, Rigger does. I can't remember exactly which commodities, but he does actually kind of trace.
Right.
According to the Rigger does, and I don't remember which commodities, but actually he does trace the kind of variations in prices to kind of seasonal matters.
Okay.
If we got another question? Have I got a hand?
Actually,
Yeah, Edward, go ahead.
This is something which I've always thought when Stroud did that splendid job on the grain tax law. It's interesting because everybody's supposed to pay the tax, but it's placed on the market at a certain time. And I think I don't know if I was the first person to point it out or not, but it was kind of obvious, is the time when that extra grain from the Dodecate and the Pentecoste is put on the market is just the point before the grain harvest. And they're putting it on the market at that time to try to keep prices low when they would have otherwise been high. So that again would be another similar case.
Yeah, I think it's a good parallel also. For Athens, we have more
Yeah, we've got
information, more
a hand at
information
the
about
very
the
back of the
CETOS,
room.
the grain. No.
There's a hand at the very back of the room over there.
Just going off of Edward's point, do you think that seasonal prices for firewood would have effects on, I guess, secondary markets? So, for instance, firing ceramics. I mean, a kiln consumes a lot of wood. Do you think you would run your kiln when wood was cheap to keep your prices down, or to keep the cost of producing pots down for the consumer? And yeah, it's basically the broader fuel economy of Delos, not just for heating, but for production of other goods.
Yeah, the question is the profit that you make on the goods that you have stockpiled, which is, in principle, even today, at least, for instance, in France, not allowed. Of course, people do that, but in theory, it's not allowed. And so the way to bypass this is also to shorten the circuit. If only final consumers can buy here with this system in Delos, either you buy large quantities, maybe 50 talents, or if you think that you need 50 talents, 100 talents of wood for the season, that's fine, you can buy them at a relatively cheap price directly from the importer on the ship. But you won't be able to speculate and make profit on this by reselling it.
Yeah, I have a quick question, remark. I found your explanation of the prohibition on selling, not only higher but lower, really fascinating. But I was also a bit amazed by it, because one element of that is in line with other kind of Greek laws about not lying in the marketplace. Asymmetry of information is a problem, and they're trying to remedy it there and avoid it. But on the other hand, there is kind of a morality imposed institutionally. You're not going to exploit the weak by kind of going up and then going down. How many parallels we have from other society for dealing with that kind of issue, but what is essentially like forbidding bargaining? Because that's what that would amount to. You cannot move up and down with price. You cannot really contract. Is that?
Maybe I should come back to the question of how it happened, really, in concreto, really. Because when I say buying on the ship, people might say, well, why would you buy 100 talents from the ship? But how do you know it's 100 talents? Well, you buy 100 talents, you pay for 100 talents, and then they are unloaded, and you unload exactly 100 talents. So it works perfectly. So there's no question about that. So once again, the question is, I will have it's a broader answer. In my view, we can get a lot from what we see from the markets of the medieval period. Mm-hmm. If you go to Paris, the markets in Normandy, etc., and there was a wonderful book on the French-American book about markets in Normandy in the 18th century. All the constraints on, for instance, on bakers that you observe, you see in Athens, you see them also in early modern period. And for instance, the granary, just exactly what Edward mentioned, le grenier de l'abondance, it was called in France. You buy grain in advance and you accumulate it, and if necessary, then you will use it to depress prices. So all kinds of measures. And in Athens, I must come back to the question, maybe to comparisons which I've not made in detail, but in Athens it was compressing the margin of it was 1 drachma per 1 obol per drachma, 1/6, not beyond 16%. You couldn't. So there are several ways to compress the margin of the middleman. Here, it's a radical solution. You force them to sell directly. I'm sure if you go to all the thousands of documents that you have for the medieval period in various cities from Britain, France, Germany, Italy, etc., you'll find something similar. Mm-hmm. But you're right, it's a very good question. I answer in more detail. I'm sure I will find.
Thank you very much. Edmund, over there.
Thank you very much. It just occurred to me, I remember there's a passage in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations where he talks about the general hatred, not of traders of wood, but of traders of grain, and how the dislike of grain merchants has effectively forced, in many cases, the farmers to be grain merchants, whereas it would be much more efficient to specialize and to have those middlemen. And I wonder whether, firstly, whether that same prejudice against the middlemen is not happening here in Delos, but whether Adam Smith would look at the Delian situation and say there are lots of negative aspects to this kind of legislation caused by removing those middlemen, and how actually easy would it be to then, I mean, would it have problems for the ease of trade, I wonder?
Yeah, let's come back to Adam Smith. In theory, the market should work better, and there should be an answer on the production should grow, and the supply would be higher, and everyone would be satisfied. So, but if you intervene brutally in the process, maybe it will have an adverse results, and people will be afraid of going to dealers to sell their wood, and prices will be higher. So there are all kinds of pros and cons against this kind of measure. I'm sure Adam Smith would not have liked this type of constraint imposed by on the middlemen. Yeah.
Michele, in the middle over there, or David again?
Sorry, hogging the microphone again. I wonder if you might speculate on the political prehistory of this law. And I'm thinking of two things. First is that passage in Aristotle's Politics talking about the demos, and then it can be broken down into particular groups of the demos represented by occupations, and how in Tenedos there's ferrymen, and in Byzantium there's lots of fishermen, and so on and so forth. And the other thing was when Edward and I were recently writing a little piece for a handbook on cities, where we use quite a lot of your work. Edward was dealing with Delos, and I think it was Claude Vial who pointed out, or some other scholar, that there are very, very many crafts people in Delos, and does that make a large kind of constituency of people using firewood who can counterbalance the vested interest in the prospective middlemen?
Absolutely, you're right. I think that craftsmen could have been in part behind the law, especially for charcoal, because there is quite a kind of little industry in Delos of bronze statuettes, of all kinds of artifacts that we know were produced in Delos, and they needed charcoal to melt down the metal, especially for iron, of course, more than for bronze, but it was needed. And these craftsmen could have been, in part, also as consumers, not to warm the house, etc., but really as professionals. Yeah.
We have a question from the middle there, Michele.
My question is about, you've explained very well how the law worked from the point of view of the Delians, but my question revolves around the point of view of the merchants, because, my question is, if there were rules so strict in Delos, the tradesmen could have easily bypassed Delos and gone somewhere else. We have the example of against Dionysodoros in Demosthenes' speeches, and we know that when the price of grain dropped in Athens, Dionysodoros decided to stay in Rhodes. And I mean, the case of the grain tax law, I mean, the grain was Athenian, but in this particular case, the wood and charcoal, I mean, certainly wasn't Delian. And so my question is also, where did it come from?
Thank you for the question. Actually, yes, but let's make a comparison with Lysias and the Cytopoli. And he's very careful to target the Cytopoli, but not the emperor, because it's vital for those who import, say, oh, gentlemen, etc. That's fine, but for the local people, hang them, no problem at all. So the kind of hatred you can have against your fellow citizens because they are at your hand, you can do what you want with them. But the emperor who import, let's be very careful with them. And I think it's the same situation here. The constraint is on the middlemen. They must have protested, of course. They said, no, we are decent Delians like you, and why? We cannot live without trading wood and charcoal. Say, well, go to grain, sell grain or whatever, or bronze or whatever, but not wood and charcoal. So it's not a general law. Even the middlemen, they can make profit on other goods, on the standard goods that won't be targeted by the law. And the emperor, well, they have to retail by themselves. There are some constraints. But after all, if they are clever, that's fine. They make profit also. And again, how does it work? It's Mirko's question also. It's not beyond the market, before the market, because the question is when you unload the goods, but the people themselves, the emperors, it comes to Delos or to any other port. It goes to the Degma or to the Agora in Delos, and it talks with what's the price here, how is it going, what are the expectations, etc. And he will decide for his price after that. It's not without any contact with the locals. It's not completely separated from the market. Up to him to make his decision. He will be trapped by his own price. If his price is fine, that's fine for him. If it's a too high price, he made a bad choice, he will pay for that. And no one will buy his charcoal or wood.
Thank you. We go Edward there again.
Actually, the student, I think, had a very good point about the question is, what is wood for? And we think of Delos and we think of the sanctuaries. But the fact of the matter is that, and this is what David was mentioning, Claude Vial in her book on Delos, Delos Indépendant, pointed out that, and without, I think was basically her thought, but kind of looking over the archaeology, was that there were more non-agricultural labor on Delos than there was agricultural labor. And this, I think, is very much confirmed in an excellent article of Pavlos Karbonos, which was published in was in Bulletin de Correspondance Hellénique within the last 10 years, and he actually went down, and it's amazing because I can't remember exactly what the number is, but I think it's about, he analyzes very, very well the different types of shops, but basically, we think of domestic dwellings in much larger proportion, and with very, very few relatively few craft kind of establishment. He said it's actually, I think the dwellings, there's only like 100 that have been excavated so far, and the number of craft shops is between 200 and 300. So you've got a huge number, and we think of Delos as a trading place, but we don't think of it actually as a manufacturing place. But there's a huge amount of manufacturing kind of going on. And one thing it's going to take up, obviously, a lot is that Pliny in Natural History says that Delos was famous for its perfume. It was obviously well known throughout the Mediterranean, and making perfume requires a great deal of wood. And the other thing is that the Clarisse Prétre's excellent book on the jewelry in the inventories, it's amazing that the number, not only the numbers but the types. There's something like about 30 different types of scoraricia, of earrings, that are being made, and different types of bracelets. And this is, as you're absolutely right, this is to reinforce your point. This is metalwork, and this metalwork obviously requires a great deal of wood, which Delos, of course, itself does not have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Véronique Shankowski, in her book, an excellent book, Parasite du Dieu, says that the import of the sanctuary itself is, if I remember, just didn't check exactly, but it's about 100 talents for the sanctuary. It's not a very big quantity in itself. So it cannot be the sanctuary or the elite that is in charge of the sanctuary that decided for the law. I don't think that. But they didn't oppose it. If they had said, no, probably they would have been able to block it. But after all, the sanctuary also profited from limited prices for this good. But the maximal pressure didn't come from the Europoi or things like that, people like that. It came from the ordinary people. I believe that. As consumers, as final consumers, as craftsmen, certainly, no doubt. Not the sanctuary is not the main organizer or proposer of the law, the Europoi.
Sylviane? Oh, yeah. No, there's nothing here. No. Do we have one last question? Otherwise, well, first of all, we can thank Alain for a wonderful paper and a wonderful start to the conference. And then we can perhaps have David and Jennifer up there for a bit of housekeeping and stuff.
Well, thank you all for coming, and after that great lecture, I'm sure you're all looking forward to tomorrow at the British School. So now we have a reception downstairs where you're all welcome to attend and carry on with more questions and comments by Edward.
Dave has
Just
something
a quick final announcement that we have some limited space for the conference tomorrow and Saturday, but if you want to join us in the hybrid format online, just come and find me at the reception and I can give you details on that. So thank you.
before we begin the final segment, I just want to take this time to thank the people that would make this concert possible. So that would include the Barts Foundation, who've donated this very lovely space. I'd like to thank the film crew, who have helped bring this concert to you guys and make me sound and look so good. And I also like to thank City Music Foundation. They're doing a wonderful set of lunchtime concerts, probably every few weeks, so please go to their website and check out what other concerts are coming up. We're going to close with 3 études tableaux by Sergei Rachmaninoff. Études tableaux are more like study pictures, and so if this program today is about the possibilities and the colors that are within the piano, the étude tableau is less a physical study and more a study about, you know, little pictures. You know, maybe a study on a scene or a study on a sort of a triptych or a diptych of some sort. And Rachmaninoff has left it completely up to your imagination. He didn't leave the name of the scenes that he was thinking of when he wrote these pieces. So I invite you all to let your imaginations run wild with this music and see what you can think of. So here are 3 studies, number 5 in E flat minor, number 8 in D minor, and number 9 in D major.